Welcome back, everyone. Okay, today we are going to talk about what's known as the narrative paradigm. This comes out of some work done by a gentleman named Walter Fisher back in the 1980s. And some people would say it contrasts with the rational world paradigm. There are plenty of scholars who try to make them complementary or at least use them as an understanding to say that they answer different questions or they're speaking to different sort of communicative realities. And we'll get into all the differences and similarities between what's known as the rational world paradigm and the narrative paradigm as we move through our discussion today. So I first want to start off with this wonderful tale known as the Epic of Gilgamesh. All right, and for those who don't know, it is the oldest known literary work that we have discovered. And when I say we, I mean a few archaeologists, some time ago. But it's the oldest known literary work in the world. It's something that you all should read. It's this epic poem. It's found in former Mesopotamia around the year 2100 BC. All right, so roughly 4,000 years ago. And what's of interest with regard to the Epic of Gilgamesh is that it has multiple cultural myths of religion and various legends and tales kind of come through this story. Embedded in this story are what are known as archetypal stories, right? So stories that not only we see out of the Epic of Gilgamesh, but then you start to realize that similar types of stories are told in various cultures at various other times, either through the written word or through oral traditions. So this is what an archetype is. It's something that it's a pattern that is noticeable. It's a common theme throughout stories. Today we'd say, various movies have these common themes. And when you start to watch a movie and you're like, ooh, that movie is very similar to this other movie I've seen. These are archetypes that then form genres, all right? So the Epic of Gilgamesh, I have this little YouTube clip. Please watch it. It's down below. It's, I don't know, a 5-10 minute explanation of the entire book on YouTube. Pretty well done. It's done with some cartoons. It's one of those crash course videos. So it's done, it's high quality. All right. And it goes through some of the main characters and what happens, etc. But some of the themes throughout this poem. The first is man's search for immortality, right? Which we see in lots of cultures and lots of stories throughout the world. Men are looking to be immortal. They're looking for ways to sort of cement their legacy in a way where it can either be true immortality, as if I will never die, or in this sort of metaphorical way where it's like I had such an impact on the culture, on the world, that my legend will never die. Right. So that's one of the themes, right? If I fight the strongest man or the strongest god, I then become a god. So this is a common theme throughout many cultures. Gilgamesh at one point is sort of caught up in this life of sin, we're going to call it. Obviously, this is 2,000 years before Christ, for instance, where we sort of get common day notions of sin. But Gilgamesh is sort of caught up in a life where he doesn't uphold his values, we'll say, right? And whether or not we refer to those as sin 2,000 years before Christ is a different conversation. But he's at least sort of just living this life of decadence, of he's not disciplined, he's being tempted, etc. And so he sort of goes through the fire, if you will, and he starts to move towards a life of redemption, right? And again, this is a story that all cultures have. You might even have this in your own life, right? So if you are a person of faith, in Christianity, there's this sort of thing known as like testimonies, where it's like when did you get saved by Jesus, and then people usually tell like, here's some horrific, ways I was living beforehand. And then, I saw the light, and all of a sudden, I changed my ways and I got out of this life of sin and temptation and everything else. All right. So there's usually this sort of moment where people, sort of mark their life before sort of becoming, I'm going to use the word enlightened as a general sense, where people usually mark their life sort of like my life before I was enlightened or saved or came to some sort of faith, and then afterwards, and it's sort of like, here's the changes I've made. Gilgamesh has these elements in this story as well. There's this call to adventure within the story, so he sort of leaves the palace and goes out in the world and has all these great adventures. We see similar things with people like Abraham, with Moses, with the Buddha. For those who are unfamiliar, the Buddha was an individual named Siddhartha Gautama who was a prince in India, and they said just stay behind the palace walls, like you don't need to go out there. And Siddhartha was like, no, like I want to go explore the world. He goes out in the world and he sees all this suffering, and then that's when Siddhartha kind of goes on his journey to figure out, how can I relieve suffering in the world? What's the secret to relieving suffering in people's lives? And then he becomes enlightened, which that's what Buddha means, the enlightened one. And so, yeah, there's this call to adventure to sort of leave the safety of one's home to go out and adventure. Now, you might say, well, this is happening for a lot of kings and important people like Gilgamesh or princes, Buddha, whatever. But there's sort of ways that, teenage American culture does this as well. You might do this, right? It's like you grew up in your parents' house, which is a very safe place. And even though it's like I have a warm bed and my parents are buying all my food, it's like me and my friends want to go on a road trip. And I'm like, that's unsafe. Like you don't have any money. The car's going to break down in the middle of nowhere. You're going to come across dangerous situations. But there is this longing in American teenagers, early 20-year-olds to say, I want to go out. Give me the freedom to fall on my face, to be broke, to be desolate, for my car to break down, for me to, I want that freedom. I can stay at home with my parents where it's very, very safe, but the adventure is far more important to me. That's what's going to help me grow. So the American road trip story for teenagers and young individuals in their early 20s has this sort of archetypal imagery in it. All right. So that's something else that's happened with Gilgamesh. He's like called beyond the palace walls to go, to go have an adventure. There are like various temptations. He gets tempted sexually, which is, an obvious image. There's a great flood, right? So you can think Noah's Ark. He meets different angels, right? So all of these sorts of things are happening within the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And again, this is 2,000 years before Christ, right? And then we got a couple hundred years after that until we sort of compile this thing that we now call the Bible. But then it happens throughout lots of different literary traditions, cultural traditions, religious traditions throughout the world. Similar types of stories are happening, all right? So it resonates as true. So this is where we get to the narrative paradigm. It resonates as true to the culture, and it teaches us things that are true, at least in a metaphorical sense, all right? So even if it's not sort of literally true, we do have this question of like, is it metaphorically true? Does it get us to a place where we are starting to think about ways we should live our lives differently based on the text, right? So you can think about, Jesus in the Bible. There are questions like, is it all literally true, or is it supposed to be metaphorically true? What does it mean? So we have, Jesus speaks in parables, right? Or these various stories. It's like, takes some fish and some bread and makes it into, and able to feed 5,000 people. Like, okay, did that literally happen, or is there some other truth I'm supposed to get there about, being generous and feeding individuals who don't have food? Like, what lesson am I supposed to get out of this? So did it actually happen, or is it some sort of metaphor with regard to how I'm supposed to live my life? All right, so again, Walter Fisher was a scholar who crafted a lot of this, what's called the narrative paradigm. And so here we go. It's founded on the principle that humans are storytelling animals. People judge the credibility of a speaker by whether or not their stories hang together, which is what we call narrative coherence. Do stories hang together? Do they have coherency? And they ring true. So they have fidelity to the culture in which they're in. So does it sound like it's something that's true? And again, even if it's not literally true, it gives us a way to move through the world as if, this seems like it's true and it can inform my life, right? Okay. No one has to specifically be trained in persuasion to be able to draw conclusions based on concepts of coherence and fidelity. All right. So we'll get to this section in the next slide. All right. But the big thing is that all of us, or the big thing for Fisher is, all humans are storytelling animals. We all have the capacity to tell a story. And what the narrative paradigm does is it says, how can storytelling be persuasive in a way that sort of learned debate skills can't be persuasive? Does the person with like good rational arguments always win, or is the person who can tell a good story, is that the person who sort of wins? And Fisher leans on on the latter, where he says telling stories and using narrative as a way to persuade audiences and shape culture, that carries a lot of weight, and we should be studying that more. All right. So, paradigms. You should know what paradigms are. I've gone over this in some other classes, but long story short, paradigm, it's a worldview, right? And it's the accepted rules, theories, and perspectives that you use to move through everyday life. Paradigms shift when drastic new evidence comes in and shatters current worldviews, right? So we all have a worldview with how the world is supposed to work. And there's certain rules we're supposed to follow. When we sort of play a game, there's certain rules we have to follow. If there's a new rule that comes into the game that we're playing, that paradigm might have to completely shift because now all of a sudden the rules don't apply. Or there's ways in which we're trying to play the game that don't work because there's this outstanding rule that's not making sense. All right. I have a couple videos here with regard to what paradigms are and how paradigms shift. I'll go ahead and put those down in the notes below that you can watch. But the long and short of it is a paradigm is the accepted rules for whatever it is you're studying. What are the accepted theories? What are the accepted methods for exploration? What are the accepted assumptions, right? That's all sort of contained within this, what's called a paradigm, all right? So the rational world paradigm starts to assume that people are logically driven. All right, that's what the rational paradigm has to assume. So this gets back to people like Aristotle, which you talked about, which you want to solve problems through logic, right? And I would say, yeah, we should solve problems through logic. Unfortunately, we know that people are illogical. We know that people are irrational. We know that people act in ways that are more emotional as opposed to logical. A logic-based paradigm like the rational world paradigm has to be mostly learned and employed by researchers and professionals. So what this means is like I have to learn the rules of logic. I have to learn the rules of debate. I have to learn the rules of making a claim and building evidence and scientific method. Like these are all rules that I have to use in order to get to some sort of rational response. And while that might be ideal, and I think it's ideal, right? So in a personal bias sense, the rational world paradigm is ideal. I wish people would just be rational. I wish they would think rationally. I wish they would follow through with ration. And I understand that we all have emotions, but it's of my opinion that emotion should not drive the policies that we sort of create for our world, right? Whether they're political, social, cultural, what have you. All right. But Fisher and others recognize that people are illogical, they are irrational, and instead of being driven by logical arguments where we sort of have to know the formal rules of debate, people tell stories, right? And all people have the ability to tell a story, right? Rational world paradigm is like, look, you got to go to school and learn how to debate properly, for instance, right? The narrative paradigm is, everybody's been telling stories for, thousands of years, right? People, like human beings, have been walking around on this planet telling each other stories, and those stories have created the world in which we live in, right? And so this is one of the biggest reasons that I am super interested in sort of rhetorical analysis in general, because the stories and the narratives that we tell, those do shape our reality, right? So the books that we surround ourselves with, the movies we collectively watch, the TV shows, right? All these stories that come into our life, that greatly impacts the way in which we see the world, and it greatly impacts the way in which I construct my world or I live my life, right? So stories are extremely important. And if you don't think they're important, I mean, the easiest way to think of it is along religion lines, for instance, right? So many people are religious. If you're not religious, just know that many people are, right? And they create their entire world around stories that are thousands of years old, right? Or at least hundreds of years old, depending on how old their religion is, whatever religion it is they're following, right? But if someone goes to church on Sunday, right, and they're a Christian, it's like so much of their life is based and constructed around Christianity. So who they marry, the way in which they raise their kids, the various holidays that they celebrate. Various religions have things like dietary restrictions or the ways in which people dress, right? The ways in which people are supposed to interact with their neighbors in their community, right? All these ways in which people act can kind of go back to the stories that they've been told through their holy text, all right? So there's that, right? And similar things happen, when little, outside of religion, people get connected to movies that are important in their life, TV shows that are important in their life, the music that people listen to, right? That shapes, right? So if I'm really interested in like a certain music genre when I'm a teenager, it's like I'm going to start sort of like mimicking that behavior. So I'm going to start dressing, the ways my favorite artists dress. I'm going to start using slang and vocabulary that they've sort of created for their lyrics. I start to repeat those, right? I start to carry myself in this sort of narrative fashion of the stories that I've seen being played out and the stories that I want to be a part of, right? So we mimic the behavior of the stories that we see. Okay. Decisions about a story's worth are based on quote unquote good reasons as opposed to rationality. So our history, our culture, and the characters all play a role in this. We'll talk about narrative fidelity here in a second. And then people just judge a story based on its consistency to what they already know. So even if the story is completely irrational and ludicrous, if there is something consistent with what I quote unquote already think I know to be true, I'm going to sort of go down the line of that story, even if it's irrational, right? Even if it doesn't align with the facts. So if it just sounds good to me, and if the story sounds correct, even if it's incorrect, but it sounds correct based on the experiences that I've had in my life, then I'm more likely to sort of follow that story, right? And I'll give you some examples here, some controversial ones in the upcoming slides. All right, so unlike the rational world paradigm, I don't have to learn the rules for debate and argumentation with the narrative paradigm, right? I don't need things like logic and empiricism. I just need to be able to tell a story that has coherence, so it makes sense. It has a clear beginning, middle, and end, right? The story makes sense within itself. And the story has fidelity, which means faithful, right? So the story rings true. It's plausible within the context of my culture. So whatever my culture is, if my culture, if it's a religious culture and, the religion that I subscribe to has miracles in it, then if I hear a story about a miracle happening, even if that miracle is completely irrational, I'm like, well, miracles happen within the context of the culture and the stories that I'm already embedded in. So it makes sense. It rings true that, why wouldn't miracles happen in the year 2021, if miracles happened, 2,000 years ago, with regard to the religion that I'm following. All right. So if somebody tells me something that is completely implausible, completely illogical, but it rings true to the culture that I'm currently in or the culture that I've known, then I'm more likely to say, yeah, that is faithful to the current pattern of stories that have been being told in my culture. All right. Narrative rationality is this idea of like what stories will I believe and what stories will I disregard. So again, this gets into sort of conflicts between religions. Different religions have, very different ways for, sort of conceptions of things like heaven and hell, things like miracles, stories about redemption and sin and like karma and everything else, right? The ones I believe are the ones that are, even though all of them are illogical, right? And I don't mean that as a slur. I mean illogical in the fact that they don't follow rationality, right? Like having faith is this idea of, trusting things that you can't test logically. So what story will I believe when it comes to competing stories that, and all of those stories are illogical or they're irrational, none of them follow logic? The ones I believe are the ones that are sort of already within the context of the culture in which I was brought up in. The ones that I get rid of, I look at them and I'm like, well, that doesn't make any sense. And it doesn't make any sense because I haven't been brought up in that cultural context. All right. The pros and cons of the narrative paradigm, hopefully they're pretty obvious. The pros are that everybody can participate because everybody has the ability to tell stories. The cons are that sometimes the stories that are being told are false, right? So even if they sound true, even if they're metaphorically true, right, they're not logically true. So you might go down this road of making bad decisions that have bad consequences because somebody told a good story. All right. So you have to be very careful when it comes to the narrative paradigm, because just because someone can tell a really good story, if that story is void of facts and stats and definitions and good logic, you're going to be taken down this path. And then you're going to start to realize, like, I'm making decisions based on someone's ability to tell a good story, as opposed to how the world actually works, sort of at the level of the logos. All right, a couple back and forths. This might be useful for your exam this coming Friday. So the narrative paradigm, it says that humans are storytelling animals. All right, they tell stories. Sometimes those stories are literally true. Sometimes those stories are more metaphorically true, right? So you get this question of, like, in the epic, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Was Gilgamesh a real person? Did he really do these things? And it could be maybe he did, probably not, but it's sort of metaphorically true. Like, I understand, when Gilgamesh leaves the kingdom to go on an adventure, it's like, oh, that's metaphorically. I understand what that means. There's some truth behind it. There's a value that I can understand. There's a way in which I can live my life that I understand. It sounds very similar to me as an angsty teenager, sort of wanting to get out of my parents' house, right, and go on this epic road trip. So even if the Gilgamesh story isn't literally true, it's metaphorically true in the sense that it gives us a lesson and an understanding about the human condition that rings true to us. All right. In contrast, the rational world paradigm posits that humans are rational. They're rational, so they're just going to follow rationality, as opposed to just following a good story. The narrative paradigm is concerned with what we call good reasons. So again, those good reasons could be things like the cultural context. It's the best story based on our lived experiences. It's coherent, so the story makes sense, and it's contextually true with regard to its fidelity. It's faithful to the culture that around it. So it all, like, good reasons to me are just, it sort of fits in my existing worldview for how the world's supposed to work. Let's say my existing worldview is completely bunk. It's completely nonsense. But if you take a story and you put it within my existing worldview and it makes sense there, that's a good enough reason for me to continue on this path, even if that path is flawed, even if that path is incorrect. All right. The rational world paradigm says, look, decisions should be based on logical arguments. You should be very dispassionate. So your feelings, your emotions should be completely removed from your decisions. The narrative paradigm says you can't remove emotions from decisions. All right. And then finally, reduce arguments to logic and choose the best one based on reasoning. The narrative paradigm says no. Sometimes we make sometimes we make decisions based on just sort of what feels good, what sounds right. Even if it's not the right decision, we do things based on what sounds correct, right? And again, this gets to the pros and cons of the narrative paradigm, where lots of times, and you can think politicians make laws based on what sounds correct or what feels good, and they end up being disastrous as far as long-term consequences. All right. So that's some of the differences between the rational world paradigm and the narrative paradigm. They don't have to be in conflict with each other. There are definitely ways in which all of us behave more rationally, and then also we behave in more of this sort of narrative paradigm realm, where we somehow deep inside of us, we know that it's not rational to believe the things we believe or do the things that we do, but we do them anyways because it just sort of fits within the cultural context that we're already in. Okay, I think I'm about to get controversial, so you got to stick with me because it'll all come around, I promise, but I'm going to probably upset everybody at some point in the next couple of slides. All right, so we're going to do this. All right, we're going to go to some of the Black Lives Matter protest stuff, okay? And sort of explain how it is that people have very different views of Black Lives Matter. And my understanding as someone who tries to be on the outside, I understand, everybody has bias and prejudice, etc. But my understanding of why it is that the Black Lives Matter is so divisive is because we do have people who are in conflict with one another with regard to, some people are situated in the rational world paradigm for what needs to be done with regard to issues of policing and the Black community. And then we have some people who are operating in the narrative paradigm, right? And so my understanding when I look at it is I think that these two groups are talking past each other because they're operating in two different worlds and they're not having the same conversation. All right. So let's try to break this down of what this will look like, right? And I think both of them can, I think both rational world paradigm folks and narrative paradigm folks, when it comes to exploring this issue of Black Lives Matter, they both have good reasons. All right. Just got to figure out a way for them to talk to each other to, because at the end of the day, we all got to, live with each other. All right. Okay. So first thing is like, what is the goal of Black Lives Matter? Well, I think a pretty good assumption is to reduce the amount of Black Americans who are killed every year generally, but then they get a little bit more specific, especially in the last summer, they got more specific with regard to issues of policing. All right. So I think that's a pretty good boiled down goal. I know there's a lot of other goals. If you go to Black Lives Matter sort of general website, they have lots of other goals, but I think, by and large, they have a lot more press and they are more outspoken when it comes to the death of a Black American, specifically at the hands of a police officer, right? That's sort of when conversations around Black Lives Matter shoots up. So I'm going to assume right now, and I think it's a pretty good assumption to say that that's probably the main, that's at least a strong pillar with regard to one of their main priorities. All right. So if we're working in the rational world paradigm, you say, okay, well, what questions should we be asking? Well, some of the questions we should be asking, if sort of the baseline is like making sure that Black Americans are no longer killed by homicide. All right. Some of the questions we should be asking are, well, how many Black Americans are killed by homicide every year? And then you get to the question of like, well, how many are killed by police officers every year, right? And then we could even get down to men versus women with regard to the Black community. We could get into there was a Black Trans Lives Matter protest last summer too, so we get into issues of like trans individuals being killed. So there's a lot of ways in which this sort of like splices and dices based on various demographics as far as perpetrator and offender. But overall, like a big question is, okay, how many Black Americans are killed every year? And we want to reduce these numbers, right? So again, this is very sort of like number oriented. This is very wonky rational world paradigm stuff, right? Just give me the numbers, okay? So some of the numbers, all right? Roughly 6,095 homicide victims. I believe this was 2019 when I pulled these stats. 6,095 homicide victims were Black in the year. I believe it was 2019, right? So roughly speaking, about 6,000 Black Americans are killed every year. All right, so that's sort of a big overarching statistic. All right, and then we can start breaking it down. I'll break it down on the next slide. So we get to the question, rational world paradigm is, how should we solve this problem, right? Well, in order to solve this problem of 6,095 Black Americans being killed every year, you get into questions about who's doing the killing, where's the killing happening? Is it happening in more urban areas, more rural areas? If it's happening in urban areas, is it happening what sort of neighborhoods? When it comes to you want to look at the weapons being used, right? So how are people being killed? Is it being, are we talking about handguns? Are we talking about rifles? Or are we talking about stabbings? Are we talking about lots of different issues? Okay. Then you get to the question of like what group of people is Black Lives Matter mostly going after and asking to change. So again, largely when it comes to being in the media, Black Lives Matter usually shows up in the media more often. And I don't want to say that this is necessarily Black Lives Matter's doing, but it's definitely partially the media as well, right? They usually show up in the media after the killing of a Black American by a police officer, right? So a lot of discussions around Black Lives Matter center around policing issues, okay? Then you get to this question of like, what policy changes is Black Lives Matter advocating to solve the problem? And some of the things that we've seen over the years, at least again, through the media. So whether or not this is sort of mainstream Black Lives Matter stuff or just stuff that's talked about on the media, is another question, right? So I'm open to being criticized for that. But things like body cameras for police officers. Last summer there was questions about defunding the police, and then people are like, well, it doesn't mean defund the police. It means take the money from the police and give it to social workers. Some people talked about community policing, which is a way of some of the versions are like get rid of like the city police and just allow civilians in the neighborhoods to sort of police their own neighborhoods, right? So community boards that sort of overlook the police, for instance, is another one, right? So there's all these different ways in which Black Lives Matter is trying to advocate for this issue to be solved, right? It's like at the end of the day, like we want fewer Black Americans dead every year by homicide, all right? So rational world paradigm is just looking at the numbers. They're like, how many people are killed every year? Who are the perpetrators, right? Where is it happening? And like, why is it happening? And what things could we actually implement in order for, you know, these numbers to go from about 6,000 a year, hopefully all the way down to zero, right? We don't want anybody dying from homicide. That's what the rational world paradigm people look at. They're like, let's look at the numbers and let's be very wonky about it. So let's look at some of the numbers. All right, so unfortunately, right, homicide is the leading cause of death for young African Americans. All right, so again, this is all rational world paradigm, folks. I'll talk about narrative paradigm on the next slide. Okay, in more than 90% of cases with a Black homicide victim, the perpetrator is a Black civilian. Right, now we get to the police officer stuff. Okay, so in 4% of these homicides, a police officer is responsible. All right, so of the 6,000, right, 4% of those individuals who are killed by a police officer. And real quick, just for sake of legal stuff, homicide doesn't mean justified or unjustified, right? So self-defense, you know, if I was to kill somebody but it was in self-defense, it's considered a homicide, but it's, you know, self-defense. All right, and then so 4% the police officer is responsible. Now it's a question of whether or not the police officer acted unjustifiably, or whether or not the police officer was acting in his or her self-defense when they, you know, fired their weapon, for instance. Okay, and then you have in 1% of all these 6,000 cases, you know, the police officer ends up killing an unarmed victim. All right, so that's kind of where we're at, right? And this chart kind of shows it. Okay, so in 1%, less than 1%. The last statistics from 2019 were somewhere between, depending on who you ask, between 10 and 15 Black Americans who were unarmed were killed by police officers. Right, so there's only about 10 to 15 individuals who were killed by police officers in 2019 who were unarmed. All right, and about 120 were killed by police total, but those other, you know, about 100 individuals had a weapon on them. All right. I know it gets tricky when it comes to, well, was the person using the weapon or not, but that, you know, just for the sake of rational paradigm, let's just stick to the wonky numbers here. Okay, so this is what the rational paradigm people do. They say, does the focus on police with regard to body cameras, community policing, etc., does it actually solve the larger problem with regard to homicide rates for Black Americans? And the rational world paradigm people, they come in and they say, no, this is kind of, you know, this is a big time suck with regard to resources. All right, so even if we reduce the numbers of individuals who are killed by cops every year from about 120 and only about 10 to 15 who were armed, if we take that all the way down to zero, we still have like 6,000 people, 6,000 Black Americans being killed every year. So we're putting a lot of emphasis on a small fraction of the whole of a larger problem, right? So this is rational world paradigm. Okay, a couple numbers you can look at here with regard to some of the stuff that's gone on last year with regard to reduced policing. So some of these communities have pulled back police, defunded the police, and now you can find plenty of stories where people are like, we need the police back. So because of some of the stuff that happened last summer, communities did sort of quote unquote defund the police, or at least pull police back. This is from CNN just a couple days ago. Chicago shootings are on the rise. Right now they're up 40% this year already. And people attribute that to a lack of funding for the police. So it's like, well, we did defund the police, and you told the police to go away. They left certain neighborhoods, and now these neighborhoods, they're still being policed, but they're just being policed by sort of like the strongest, baddest dude in the neighborhood, as opposed to police officers. All right. This was the Chicago murder rate from 2019. It was 506, and then in 2020 it shot up 50%. So in 2020 there were 774 murders in Chicago, and again, people were looking at this and saying, look, like, we tried to do that. Like, we looked for things like community policing, defunding the police, investing money away from the police into some social services, etc. And the result was 270 more murders. This is obviously a problem. Okay. Now, these, so we might have reduced the amount of police interactions. This does reduce sort of like police and community friction, but that doesn't mean that sort of like two guys on the street having friction with each other completely goes away. All right. So again, this is rational world paradigm, people. They look at the numbers and they're saying, you know what? A lot of this focus on the police doesn't make a lot of sense with regard to the numbers. Now, stick with me. Now we're going to the narrative paradigm. Okay, so if you were upset with me for the rational world paradigm stuff, here's where we look at the narrative paradigm. Okay. So the narrative, the people who are more narrative paradigm driven, right? They look at it and they say, yeah, but the numbers aren't the point. All right. There's a larger sort of systemic cultural issue at play here with regard to the story that is being told in predominantly African American neighborhoods in the city and their decades long bad relationship with the police. All right. So the rational world paradigm people are saying, like, here's the numbers and the numbers don't add up. Why are you so focused on the police? The police, by and large, as far as proportionally, aren't really the problem when it comes to Black Americans dying by homicide. And the narrative people are coming in and they're saying that's not really the point. Like, the numbers aren't necessarily the point, or they're part of the point, but they're not the entire point. All right. So the narrative paradigm people, they're more likely to come in and say, look, like, yes, the numbers are the problem, but the larger problem with regard to why some of these numbers are so through the roof has to do with this tenuous relationship between the police and African American communities at large, right? So even if the numbers are very small with regard to police killings, which they are, right? Especially when we're talking about unarmed. Again, you're talking about somewhere between 10 and 15 per year. We're talking about, this tenuous relationship where people don't even feel safe talking to the police. People don't feel like they know their local police officer. When police come into some people's neighborhoods, the police are dressed like stormtroopers as opposed to, your nice little, like, Leave It to Beaver, cop kind of driving down the road, waving to everybody, stopping and talking, right? So some people in these communities are saying, look, it's not just about the numbers, it's about the relationship we have with the police in our neighborhoods with regard to when something bad happens in my neighborhood, do I even feel like I can talk to the police? Do I feel like I can call the police, or do I feel like the police are just going to completely overlook my neighborhood? And if my neighborhood has a history of bad relationships with the police, then it feels true to me that calling the police in 2021 is just going to be the same as calling the police in the 1980s if I grew up in this neighborhood in the 1980s and the police were, total jerks, right? For, a lack of a better term. All right. So this storytelling is essential in opening dialogue and allowing people to tell about their experiences outside the rational world paradigm. So again, if you take the rational world paradigm and you just show people the numbers and say, look, the police really aren't the problem here when it comes to homicide rates for Black Americans. You can reduce police homicides down to 0, and you're still going to have 6,000 murders a year, or 6,000 homicides, again, because some of them are self-defense, 6,000 homicides a year within Black communities. And people on the Black Lives Matter side are going to say, but that's not the point. That's not the only point, right? It's not just about reducing police numbers to 0. It's about reducing police violence to 0 and improving relationships with those individuals who are supposed to be protecting the neighborhood. Because if these communities have a better relationship with the neighborhood. Then when two guys over here start fighting with each other, I feel safe calling in the police to come in and sort of deter the situation, right? I feel comfortable calling the police in to help, diffuse the situation. Instead, I might be worried if I call the police in, the police are gonna, rough these two guys up, and like one of them might end up on the bad end of a cop's gun, right, or in handcuffs, or lots of other bad things with regard to, police relationships. So it's not just about taking the numbers from 6,000 down to zero with regard to overall homicides. It's not just about reducing the number of bad cop interactions from about 10 or 15 down to zero. It's about an overall dialogue where people feel as if they can speak to the police and the police will treat them and their community in a respectful manner, right? The police will come into their neighborhood and they actually feel like the police are protecting them, again, as opposed to, look, I live in a neighborhood and I've never in person seen cops dressed like stormtroopers, right? There are people who live in certain neighborhoods where the only time they see cops are when cops are dressed like stormtroopers, right? Where cops are in their cars, constantly in bulletproof vests. And here's the thing, the cops have reasons to, be in certain protective gear, depending on what their beat is, right? So I'm not dismissing the rationality of the cops to want to have protective equipment, right? But what the narrative paradigm shows is that there's a completely different story about who the cops are in some neighborhoods versus who the cops are in other neighborhoods. And unless we can open up dialogue and allow people to explain through storytelling the relationship with the cops and how they understand the cops and the ways in which they interact with the cops and how the cops have interacted with them and their community, then all of a sudden then the only thing we're going to have is a bunch of people on the rational world side saying, look, the cops actually don't commit that many acts of like unjustifiable violence, right? And you're going to have the narrative paradigm people over here saying, okay, I understand that, but that's not the whole story. There's more to it than just whether or not the cops fatally shoot someone. There's this whole tenuous, contentious relationship with regard to how the cops treat people, whether or not I feel safe calling the cops. If I do call the cops, am I worried that the cops are going to take me out as opposed to protecting me, right? So what storyline do I have around the cops? I grew up in a community where people are like, the cops are the good guys. If anything's bad, go find a cop. The cop will help you out. The cop's your friend. All right. The cop comes to school. They do the DARE program. They, let you hang out. They, I don't know. They probably, whatever. Like the cops are cool, right? Some people grow up in a neighborhood where it's like the cops are the bad guys, right? That's a different narrative story that they have if the cops have been engaged in any sort of just like disrespectful behavior, not even violent behavior, but if the cops are walking through your neighborhood and they're just disrespectful, right, or they're dismissive of you, or they look down on you, it's like, yeah, of course you're gonna have a different relationship with your cops, your local police officer, than somebody who grew up in a neighborhood where the cops driving by and knows your parents and they're waving at you and the cops always helping you. All right, so that's what the narrative paradigm can do here. All right, so even if the proposals don't make sense to the rational world paradigm, right, things like body cameras, community policing, like these things don't make sense to the rational world paradigm with regard to changing up police. All right, the narrative paradigm makes sense of people's lived experience because the narrative paradigm is able to express bad relationships that have happened within police departments, within certain cities or certain areas of certain cities, right? Things like disrespect, lack of trust. People can express this through the narrative paradigm in ways that they can't express that through the rational world paradigm, right? I can show someone a spreadsheet and say, look, the cops are behaving well, right? The cops really don't commit violent acts against people. When they do, it's almost 99.9% of the time justified, right? The cop was acting in self-defense, right? So I can show somebody that spreadsheet, but there's a bigger story behind cops and cops in certain cities in the United States that can't be told through the numbers. And that's what the narrative paradigm allows people to do. It allows people to tell a story beyond the numbers, and that helps us get to a better understanding of what the world might look like for someone. Because if I just look at the numbers, I look at people and I'm like, this is dumb. Like, why are you blaming the cops for everything? The cops actually are, for the most part, like it's pretty good stuff here. Like, they're not killing people like hardly ever, right? But narrative paradigm is like, no, 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 no. Like there's a whole lot more here that I need you to understand as far as just, anxiety and stress and again, friction in these relationships that we need to solve. So it's about a lot more than just the numbers. All right. Okay. Hope I did a pretty good job balancing that out and explaining it. Hopefully you got something out of it. Use this. I'm going to put some links below. All the URLs that were in this PowerPoint will be linked down below so you can sort of play around, mess around with them. On Friday, you have a test. So take the test, submit it. I'll see you later.